Hello, 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 and welcome back to Kindred Skulls. My name is Gregg Blake, and I'm joining, as always, my delightful co-host Matt Freese here on this final day of June, 2023. How you doing, man?
Excellent. Honestly, I thought I was on this call with Kenny Powers, man. You're looking good.
I'm gonna take that as a compliment. Kenny Powers is a handsome man. How's the air quality up there
It actually got bad again yesterday. We're
yesterday?
recording this on a Friday afternoon. What a wonderful time to be doing a podcast, honestly. But it got bad again yesterday. It wasn't as bad as it apparently was, like earlier this month.
Yeah,
When we had the like dystopia, like the Mexico filter pictures of New York, right?
everybody's posting Blade Runner photos on
Yeah,
Instagram.
exactly. I actually was traveling for work, so I missed that.
Oh,
I
nice.
missed that couple of days. It was pretty hazy yesterday. It's a little. I'm looking out the window right now. It's a little bit hazy again here today, but it's not as bad as it was previously. So I'm
Okay,
doing
good.
okay. I know
All
Chicago and like the Midwest, probably people in Minnesota got worse of it than we did this time here
right.
out on the
That's
East
what I was
Coast. So
reading. I was reading that. It's been pretty crazy. I'm sure some of our listeners are experiencing that. I hope everyone's staying safe and enjoying their summers despite that. This is a sleepy pod today. A sleepy pod, a summer pod. We're just checking in. Camp is around the corner. But we hadn't had a chance to talk to you all about new additions to the team, new
subtractions.
subtractions from the team. So there's some things to talk about, and um, Matt is. I got a lot to share with you all today, and Nick unfortunately wasn't able to join us today. He'll probably be back around camp time, talk about what's going on in camp. But for now, it's Matt and I. And what do you say, Matt? You want to get right into this thing?
Yeah, well, I was gonna say, it's been a sleepy kind of offseason. I don't know. There's kind of been more activity this offseason for the Vikings than I think we get in a normal offseason. But it has not been a sleepy offseason for the members of Kindred Skulls, particularly Nick, who's being worked to death currently, I think, and
Yeah.
Greg, who, if you're watching on video, you might notice has a new background. He's got a cool new office setup that he's been working on all summer. So
I'm
we're
no longer
finally
back there by a window
yeah
right
we're
behind me.
we're finally getting around to this. I'm honestly excited for today's show. We get to go through kind of a deep dive scouting report on all of these players that the Vikings added, so it's a little bit exciting for me. So let's jump right into it here, Greg.
All right, so let's talk about the subtractions first. Let's discuss first my most heartbreaking story of the off season. One of my favorite football players, Dalvin Cook, no longer a Minnesota Viking, unlikely to re-sign. He's got offers already from Miami. Some say possibly the Chargers as well, a couple other places. Definitely not going to be a Viking next year. Huge bummer for me. I know that the fan base has kind of split on him over the years. I still think he was the heartbeat of our offense, and I will continue to believe that until I'm proven otherwise, I guess. But um, Matt, you're the numbers guy. What do you think? Good or bad for the Minnesota
Sorry,
Vikings that
I
we
didn't realize we had Pat McAfee as a guest on the show today. um,
yeah.
so obviously, there's been the Pat McAfee quote unquote controversy where he was like Dalvin Cook opens things up for Justin Jefferson, and he's the reason Justin Jefferson is so successful. Is like what the first quote was before he walked it back or whatever. Um,
I wouldn't go that far, but I think that he's a big part of what we do offensively.
I think I kind of walk a middle ground on this conversation where, ultimately the way the marketplace in the NFL works, paying running backs typically doesn't work out. And Dalvin Cook is an example of how paying running backs a high salary typically doesn't work out. Ultimately, with the way rushing and rushing production is a function of offensive line play more so than it is a function of running back. It's not a function of running back. I want to make that very clear. Like running backs matter to an extent, but the problem is with the way salaries for a player like Dalvin Cook or an Ezekiel Elliott earlier who got cut earlier this offseason end up taking up too much of a cap for the impact that they have on their team. And that's why Dalvin Cook ends up getting cut, right? It saves the Vikings a lot of cap space over the next couple of years. Dalvin Cook, however, I think still was pretty clearly the best running back on the Vikings roster. So it's a downgrade at running back. You look at Alex Madison's performance, I think he was noticeably worse than Dalvin Cook just in terms of general productivity. It was yards per attempt. He was worse in that stat. I don't think yards per attempt is a great stat for running backs, but when you're below 4 like Madison is, and that's not exactly fair to Madison because he served a different purpose than Dalvin Cook did in the offense, so using that as a metric isn't 100% fair. But if you look at Dalvin Cook, like, the primary issues, and I would say the decline he saw last year over his previous level of play, which was at a very high level, was that there were so many like ankle tackles and that sort of thing where you were used to him breaking out of that, where he just ends up getting tripped up and he still falls forward for a couple of yards in those situations, but gains that used to be 10, 12 yard gains turned into 4 or 5 yard gains just because he was just barely tripped up at the line of scrimmage, right? Or a play that you think, oh, Dalvin might take this to the house, he ends up getting tripped up.
Right.
And I think that really was the difference from Dalvin. And if he wasn't doing that last year, he might have been retained by the Vikings, frankly, because he could have been playing at a really high level. Now, maybe part of that and what's his name, Zach Hiller, would have you believe that all of that was due to the shoulder surgery that Dalvin had in the offseason that he frankly should have had 3 off seasons ago. Like, it's kind of absurd that he didn't have it, and it punished the Vikings, right, by him having the multiple dislocations, fumbling the ball in that game earlier this year to where the point where he had to wear the harness all season. Like, that kind of harmed the Vikings too. But I think ultimately, like, just from an analytical perspective, Dalvin Cook was not worth the salary that he was getting, right? Which you're gonna have with veterans on the roster. Like, it's a salary cap league. There are gonna be rookies who earn less than they're getting, and there are gonna be veterans who earn more than they deserve. But teams are gonna look to move on from those veterans who are earning more than they deserve, and Dalvin Cook was one of those. I think the Vikings running game won't suffer too much with Alex Madison and the combination of Wong Moon and Chandler, just because I think the run blocking and the things that the Vikings have done to bolster the run game outside of that, like the addition of Josh Oliver, the reinvestment in CJ Ham, will lead to a more productive baseline for the run game. So even if the running back performance is lower, you're probably going to see a relatively as productive of an offense. And just to address the Pat McAfee thing a little bit, I mean, a bunch of people have been on this, but like, Dalvin Cook is not the reason Justin Jefferson was successful. The Vikings were not efficient running into even light boxes where they were -1 in the box this year. The Vikings faced like the highest level of 2 high. Like, everything the defenses that played the Vikings did told you, we are trying to stop Justin Jefferson, and that is our number one goal. There was nothing in what those defenses did that was attempting to say, oh, we're worried about Dalvin Cook in the run game. Like, just watch the tape. That's all I have to say to that. Like, it's very obvious that teams were trying everything they possibly could to stop Justin Jefferson.
Yeah. I only have 2 thoughts remaining on Dalvin. One is that it hurts it makes me sad. But I do think that, if we were going to move on, now is probably the time.
Mm-hmm.
I feel that way about a few other members of the team that are still sticking around, but we'll save that for another day. The other thing I would say is that if you're a fan who's totally subscribed to the RBBC concept and you think that this is going to be literally a 1-to-1 changeover, I think you have a rude awakening coming. That's the only thing I'll say. I do think Dalvin is quite underrated by a portion of the fan base. But
And let's go back through some of the good times with Dalvin for a little bit, right? Because
it
I
was
mean, this
great.
last year, like, that comeback against the Colts, he was obviously instrumental in that. He had the long run in the Bills game, he had the Dolphins game, and outside of those long runs, like, he didn't have a ton of impactful stuff. But think back to 2017, right? Literally the first game of his career. Adrian Peterson is in the building. Obviously, the NFL did it to build up this. Adrian Peterson's back playing against the Vikings, and the person who stole the show in that game, besides Sam Bradford somehow, who was freaking awesome as well, was Dalvin Cook, who rushed for 139 yards in that game. He absolutely dominated. Obviously, that rookie season was cut short, but he was a lot of fun. I mean, and the explosive plays, that game against the Packers where he basically single-handedly won it. I think that was in 2020 or whatever, with that huge rushing touchdown. He scored like 4 touchdowns in that game. They won 20 to 21. Like, just some awesome moments from Dalvin Cook's career.
The highs were always very high with Dalvin. I do think he never quite established himself the way that I thought he would, and a lot of that has to do with injury.
Yeah,
Uh, he just never quite got to the level I think he is capable of
yeah, and
possibly.
that's unfortunately another reason, it makes sense for the Vikings to move on. He's had consistent injury issues where once you're paying a guy that much, you need him to be on the field basically all the time, right?
Yeah.
Or it really starts to hurt. And then, obviously running back age, he's only like 26 years old, which is kind of crazy to think running backs are aging out of the league at that age. But it's honestly kind of true. Like, they have been. How much have you heard from running backs past that age, really on a significant level? So it's unfortunate that that's the reality for running backs in today's NFL, especially when they're capped with the rookie wage scale of how much they can earn on that rookie contract, right? Because they provide so much surplus value to teams when they're mid-round picks or a second-round pick even on that rookie contract. And then by the time it's time to get rewarded, the teams are ready to throw them in the trash. So they really never get paid what they're earned, and that's a league-wide issue,
It's
right?
going to be everyone that we talk to in our friend group, Matt, thinks I'm insane, but I really believe it's going to be one of the biggest issues with the CBA. I think the running back rooms around the league are going to put their foot down on how they're getting treated. But it's a whole other discussion for another day. Shall we move on?
Yes, yes. Let's move on.
Speaking of moving on, Za'Darius Smith, no longer a Viking, one pretty good season on a very
Yeah,
bad defense. Now he's a Cleveland Brown. We don't have to spend a ton of time on this. We traded him a sixth, a seventh for a couple of fifths, kind of just a salary wipe kind of deal. Matt, I'm curious to hear from you just generally. What do you think the impact will be on our defense? And you've actually touched on this a little bit
Yeah,
already.
so I think the impact is relatively significant. I mean, I think we talked about, as free agency approaching, who we'd want to move on from and who we wouldn't. I said I did want to move on from Dalvin Cook. I know I'm not sure if you were on that episode or if it was just Nick Gregg,
I
but
think it was.
I would want to move on from Dalvin Cook. And one thing I want to mention here is the trade compensation. Like, I was hopeful that the Vikings would get something in return for Dalvin Cook in terms of a trade compensation. Seems like teams just weren't willing to pay that salary. Seems like maybe if the offseason had played out a little bit differently, where if he hadn't gotten that shoulder surgery, maybe something would have gotten done with the Dolphins before they drafted Devon A-Chain in like the third round or whatever. So it really is kind of an interesting combination of circumstances. For Z, I don't think the Vikings would have gotten much more value than what they got trading him earlier. For veterans of that age with that salary, you just don't tend to get a lot back. And the two
Yeah.
fifth round picks, which, are pick upgrades, are it's a disappointing return, I think personally. Like, to me, it's not enough of a return for me to say I would rather have Za'Darius Smith on this roster at $11.65 million salary or whatever he got from the Browns, because he didn't get more. Really, I think he might have only gotten $1 million more than his earning potential from the Vikings. The difference is that salary is fully guaranteed with the Browns, where basically he could have been cut for no cap hit by the Vikings if they really wanted to do that this season. They took on as much dead cap by trading him as they would have by cutting him, basically. So that's really not, a good situation for him. And he said that to the Cleveland media, where basically like, yeah, I wasn't happy with the contract that I signed, so that's why I wanted to end up getting traded. I think I would have preferred the Vikings to kind of extend that olive branch and be willing to give that guarantees. Now, you don't know. Maybe Za'Darius was like, you know what, I'm mad about this initial contract. Like, I feel like I was tricked and I don't want to do a deal with these guys again. Like, maybe that could have been some of it. You don't know what the individual feelings are. But my problem is, like, doing that extends an olive branch to the rest of the players that says we're willing to work with you. And there's another player in particular who I'm saying this for. He's also an edge rusher. His name is Daniil Hunter, right? Who obviously
How you gonna bring him up, man?
who didn't show up to mandatory minicamp, and like, I think the Vikings, I think, need to get a deal with Daniil done. Whether or not they're able to, who knows, right?
I
That's for
specifically
us to see.
left I specifically left Daniil Hunter's name out of my mouth this recording because I didn't want to get into it. Do you want to get into
No,
it?
I don't really want to get into it. That we can
Okay.
we can save for when something happens. But I think,
Okay.
like, my point is the management of the Za'Darius Smith situation, I don't necessarily agree with because of the implications for that situation, right? If you're willing to ship a guy out rather who showed that he was productive, who I think has another productive season in him this year, rather than give him the money that he frankly deserves, right? The Vikings got him for basically 1 year, like $3 million or something is all we paid him last year. It was a crazy cheap deal for the level of the production that the Vikings got out of Za'Darius Smith. So it was a great signing by Kwesi. I think the handling downstream of it could have been a little bit better, and that's my overall point. Like, I'm a little bit disappointed in the return. I think the Vikings defense is worse without Za'Darius Smith in the pass rush. I don't have a lot of faith in Marcus Davenport being a one-for-one replacement for Za'Darius Smith. I think he very well could be. Like, he has the potential to be, but given his injury history and given his production history, like, I'm not sure he's going to give you what we got from Za'Darius Smith did last year. And that makes the room just one more space thinner. Because, again, if we're not able to get this Danielle Hunter situation, now our edge room is catastrophic, right? Losing both Za'Darius Smith and Danielle Hunter. We don't have anybody besides Marcus Davenport who I think can start on an NFL roster. So that's where it becomes an issue for the Za'Darius Smith thing for me.
And I agree with all of that. And the discussion about Daniil, maybe we won't have to have, but a discussion for another day. But the thing I think, for me, the thing that this whole offseason has been about, and really what I've been feeling for a while now is, is this a team that is trying to compete? Or is this a team that is trying to, reset, rebuild, whatever fucking word you want to use? And it seems like the decisions we're making are kind of like split down the center still. There's been a few years of this now where it's
I mean,
like,
I don't know if this is even a question. Kwesi and Kevin O'Connell have said they want to do a competitive rebuild.
I
They've
know,
been very
but
clear, and all of the moves say that yes, this is exactly what they're trying to do. They're trying to thread the needle of getting themselves into good contracts with young players and developing young players while still remaining competitive and winning football games.
but it looks ugly and it seems like it's going to result in a lot of ineffective football. So we'll see what happens. I mean, I just think I
I
think
don't know. I don't
that's
know. It was pretty effective last year. They won 13 games. Like, it wasn't the biggest.
well,
It was a fraudulent 13 games, right?
these
Like,
are
let's
all
be real. But
these are all debates that we've had before, and
yeah,
I don't want to drag us back into into that, but like you know, it's just like it's like you're saying, if you want to compete, losing Z for nothing doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. So we'll see what
yeah.
happens. We'll see what happens. Definitely not as emotional losing Z as losing Dalvin, but definitely as big an effect on the team, the field, what we're putting out on the field. Any other final thoughts on Za'Darius?
No, I mean, like you said, obviously it's not as big of a loss from a Vikings fan. He was only here for 1 year, but it was a lot of fun too. Like, he and Danielle Hunter both got over 10 sacks. It was the pass rush, when the edge rushers when they were on seemed to be the only thing that really worked for this defense the
Yeah.
past year. So it'll be interesting to see. Obviously, I have a lot more faith in Brian Flores' ability to run a defense than I do Ed Donatell's ability to run a defense after having seen that for a full season. But it'll be interesting to see how Flores is able to cobble up the production at the edge spot or in the pass rush game to match. And obviously, he's going to do a lot more blitzing, that sort of thing. So it will be more varied looks. But I'm interested to see, with all the gambles that the Vikings have made on defense, and we'll get into this as we get into some of these rookies, how the Flores defense is going to come together.
Well, you teased it well, Matt. Let's talk about the rookies. Let's get this. So we drafted six
It
players
was
in
six.
the
It was 6 players drafted, and I also have Ivan Pace Jr., who was a UDFA. I wanted to do Andre Carter. Have not gotten to Andre Carter yet. And just to give people a primer for how this is going to go, I'm going to give a full scouting report. We're going to try to go as in depth as possible on these players for you. And then if we don't, we're probably not going to get to everybody today just because of time constraints. But we'll finish up the rest of it later. We promised you full in depth scouting reports on these guys, and you're going to get them.
absolutely. And let's start with our first round pick, a pick that I think everybody's really excited about. We talked before the draft. Should we take a receiver? Does it make sense? And you guys kind of convinced me despite my apprehension that receiver does make sense for this team. And luckily, you did because we took one. So let's talk about Jordan Addison. And before you get into the scouting report, let's just touch on the fact that he missed OTAs. Are we concerned at all about this injury?
Probably not. I really have no idea. I mean, I from an
Here's what
OTA
bothers me.
from an OTA perspective, I wouldn't be worried until he starts missing significant time in training camp. That's when rookies really get behind the eight ball.
This is what I'm worried about. I don't care about OTA. I agree with you. Like the literally missing OTAs, I don't think is the end of the world. What concerns me is a nagging, unexplained injury. Typically in Vikings history, like let's be honest, Matt. Like when that shit
So you want to talk about Danielle Hunter now, Greg?
like when our team kind of pushes that stuff aside, oh, it's not a big deal. He missed OTAs, but it's this thing with his foot. He'll be fine. Like whenever I hear this kind of stuff, it's years of trauma, Vikings fan trauma that I'm going. What does that mean? Like, why is he missing OTA? What do you mean he's got a foot thing? What the hell does that mean? So I'm a little concerned, but I agree. We have no evidence that he's hurt really, really bad or anything. So probably not something we need to worry about for now. If he misses some training camp time right away,
Yeah.
alarm bells. Alarm
Yeah.
bells. Big
If he's not ready for the start of training camp, that's when he's really going to start to fall behind because those first couple days, your basic installs of the core of your offense, and if
Yep.
he needs to catch up on that, he's not going to be able to get to the more advanced stuff. It's going to limit his ability to get on the field early. So that
Yep.
is absolutely critical that he's back and healthy, which is why it's important to hold him out for that sort of stuff if you think it's a short-term injury, but you don't want any re-aggravation.
It
Um,
re-aggravation or like the thing I'm concerned about is they found some kind of evidence that like if he plays on it, there's a risk of a Lisfranc or something like that.
exactly.
And they were just like, okay, we're gonna shelve you until camp, or that kind of stuff concerns me. But like, it's complete speculation. We have no evidence of anything, so it's really nothing to
Yep.
get into there. So set that aside. Let's talk about the exciting parts. Who is Jordan Addison, Matt? And I'm gonna kind of let you take it away here. I may chime in with questions, but I know you have a ton prepared for everybody, so I'm excited to hear your
Yeah.
thoughts on Jordan Addison.
Yeah, absolutely. So Addison, let's start with kind of biographical information, and we'll do this for all of the guys. So he's going to be 21 for his entire rookie season. He was one of the youngest players in the draft. I think he was one of the 20 youngest players out of 350 some in the eligible for the draft. And actually, it's kind of interesting if you look at the draft. Like the youngest players are typically receivers and running backs. Those seem to be guys who come out relatively early in the process and they're more ready to go. So it's not unique among the receivers in this draft class. Like most of the other guys who were drafted in the first round are around the same age range as Addison. But it's notable that he'll be a younger player, just like Justin Jefferson was a younger player coming out into the NFL. So that's actually found to be really important. And if you play like dynasty fantasy football or something, like those guys hammer breakout age and that sort of thing. If you remember Josh Doxson back when the Vikings drafted the Laquan Treadwell, everybody was like, "Oh, he's too old. He's never going to work." It turns out he doesn't work. So people have found that age does correlate pretty heavily to success at the wide receiver position in the NFL. So that's a good note for Addison, I would say, on the scouting report. Obviously, in Pitt, so he spent 3 years in college. His first season was at Pitt. Or his first 2 seasons was at Pitt, and then he transferred to USC. At Pitt in 2021, Kenny Pickett was his quarterback, obviously a first-round draft pick. He won the Blitnikoff Award as the most productive receiver in college football, or the best receiver in college football is voted on it. But he was one of the most productives that season. So that year he had 100 catches, almost 1,600 yards, and 17 touchdowns. USC, his numbers weren't nearly as good last season. He didn't have nearly that level of production, but he played a lot fewer snaps. He missed a couple games with injury, and he only played 335 passing play. He was only on 335 routes compared to 566 in his year at Pitt. So if you prorate his production to match the number of snaps he had as Pitt, he would have had 100 catches, almost 1,500 receiving yards, and 13 touchdowns, right? So obviously it's not quite as good as his Blitnikoff Award winning season, but it's approaching that level of production and maintaining that consistency from year to year in college football while switching teams, while learning a new offense. Granted, it was Lincoln Riley's USC offense with the Heisman Trophy winner and Caleb Williams, right? Like, he's not had a high level of difficulty in terms of the quarterbacks he's played with over the 2 seasons, but he's
Who's Caleb
maintained a high
Williams?
level of production with him. Go ahead.
I said, who's Caleb Williams? I've never even heard of that guy.
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe the first overall pick next year or something like that. But no, so that gives you a baseline for how productive Addison was as a college player, which is to say absurdly productive, right? He was absolutely awesome when it came to playing wide receiver in college. So, the question is, go ahead.
Can I just add something to the idea of playing with great players as a receiver? I think that, to me, that I've always viewed that as actually a positive. Like,
Sure.
if you deliver, if you have a great quarterback who's doing putting the ball exactly where it should be, or
Mm-hmm.
letting be having confidence in you, and throwing it, and giving you a chance to go get it, doing things that veteran NFL quarterbacks do, and you deliver, to me that's a great sign for your NFL career, because it's like that means you know how to play the game. You
Yeah.
know how to work with a great player, and you're going to most likely end up with, at some point in your career, a great quarterback who knows how to get you the ball. So it's a good sign to me.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not like, his production is extremely impressive, even considering the circumstances. So it's not like he produced like an average college receiver despite having great people around him. He produced like a very elite, like the best receiver in college football while having great players around him. So that is a better sign than somebody who would have been an average producer, right? And so scouting Addison, I watched all 11 games that he played in this season, and then I was able to watch 3 games from his 2021 season. I watched the 2021 games to see how he developed a little bit, just to give me a little bit of a flavor of extra. And I have to own up on this podcast because prior to the draft, I was against drafting Jordan Addison in the first round. And I will get into that major concern I still have with him. But to me, I've become a lot more positive, I think, after watching him on who he is as a player. So to me, my concern with Addison, prior to the draft, having not watched him, was his size, where he's only 5'11", and more importantly, weighed in at 171 pounds at the combine. That's really, really light for an NFL receiver. And if you look at the list of receivers who have succeeded at that weight, it's guys like Marquise Brown, who runs a 4.3, and Deshaun Jackson, who runs a 4.3 and was like the best deep threat in the history of the NFL, but also never really fully lived up to his potential because he was always hurt, right? So, you look at the guys and the only one who doesn't really fit that profile is recent, and that's Devonta Smith, right, for the Eagles. And Devonta Smith has this thing where he is an overly physical receiver for his size. Like, he's crazy good at contested catches. He's got great body control, and he wins with physicality, in a way that's kind of weird because he's just this wiry, 170-pound guy who's 6 feet tall. Like, he shouldn't be able to win in that way, but he does at the NFL level. I don't think that's going to be part of Addison's game, and that was never part of his scouting report heading in. And I don't think that's part of his scouting report after having watched him. And Addison only ran, a 4.49, basically a 4.5 on the slower end. Plenty fast enough for an NFL receiver. Like, you don't need to run faster than a mid 4.5 to be a high level NFL receiver. We see that with DeAndre Hopkins. We see that with Devontae Adams, right? Like, those are the times those guys ran. But my problem was the size with that lack of speed, with the lack of physicality. The combination, to me, says this guy might not be able to be a long-term NFL number one wide receiver. I think there is a little bit of a paradigm shift in the NFL where they are moving to these smaller players, so that might mitigate that. But I think secondarily, the reason it doesn't really matter for the Vikings is that the Vikings have Justin Jefferson, and they'll have Justin Jefferson for the entirety of Jordan Addison's rookie contract, right? So they're never going to ask him to be a primary target in the passing game. It's always going to be Justin Jefferson while he's a Viking, right? So insofar as that's the case, I think Jordan Addison is actually going to have a great rookie season, assuming he's able to get on track with the injury, because he will be able to complement Justin Jefferson to that level, right? My concern with Addison is when he's faced up against the Jalen Ramseys of the world one-on-one in press, and they're physically trying to beat him up and knock him off his path. When teams have to dedicate multiple resources to even attempting to stop Justin Jefferson, right? Like, the only way teams shut down Justin Jefferson was basically pressing him hard at the line of scrimmage and having a cover two safety over top, so you had a high-low bracket, and you're literally dedicating 2 players on the entire defense to covering Justin Jefferson. That led to the 10-catch TJ Hawkinson games, right? It'll also help lead to the massive Jordan Addison game. So that led to the game where, who was it, Aruorie for the Lions had like 8 penalties because he kept holding Adam Thielen because he couldn't keep up with him one-on-one. And that was Adam Thielen, who the Vikings have moved on from, but is slowed down at this point in the career. If Jordan Addison's there, he's going to crush that even harder, I think, based on the scouting report. So let's get into who Addison is as a player. I said he's a polished player with the skill set to contribute immediately in the NFL. He's a nuanced route runner with the toolbox to beat press. He tells a story with his routes, and that's particularly important. So he's got the toolbox to beat press. He doesn't really have the strength to move through press, like he doesn't fight through press, but he does have the ability to take a step back, do a swim move to get around it, and he can defeat his opponent's hands, which is something that's critical with press. He's got a quickness off the line. He's got a variety of releases that he uses to be able to do that. And the tells the story with his routes thing is where it's particularly impressive. Telling a story and also having sharp footwork on cuts and route breaks. That's where Addison's really impressive. He will do things like stem his route inside a little bit and lean inside, getting the quarterback to move inside on an outbreaking corner route. So he's selling that where he is forcing the cornerback to drift towards him, and then he breaks across that cornerback's momentum without that cornerback knowing. That's something that's really important. He has really sharp route breaks. There's a video of him, during the Vikings rookie minicamp, I think, where he's running a drill, and some route running guru or whatever did a breakdown of it, where he's talking about how Addison drops his weight and allows him to turn really quickly. Addison will make hard, flat cuts on dig routes. So something you want to watch for on dig routes is the number of steps on route breaks is the number of steps it takes for the player to make that break. If they're chopping their feet and it takes them 5-7 steps to make that break, that's not an efficient break. It takes Addison 3 steps. And then how flat they are on a flat route, like a dig route, where, on a turn, a turn should take a player like 2 yards from when he starts the turn to when he is running horizontal. Some guys won't be able to make that turn, and they'll drift an additional 1 or 2 yards upfield, and that's bad for a receiver because it gives the corner more space to recover, not only and undercut that route, but it throws off the positioning and the timing with the quarterback for the throw. Addison will be able to do that and get there with a very flat route within 3 steps after making a hard step for his break. So it's really impressive from Addison, just his ability and his nuance, and there's tons of examples. Actually, for all of these guys, I've written scouting reports over at Zone Coverage. I've got tons of examples of plays up for all of these guys that kind of show you from a visual perspective what I'm talking about here, but it's really impressive.
I highly recommend, if you're a listener who hasn't checked out Matt's writing at Zone Coverage, you really got to check it out. He's if you like listening to him, you'll love reading him too.
Yeah, so all that to say, Jordan Addison is an extremely impressive route runner, and he's an advanced route runner for the NFL level from day one coming in. So I do think that will help. He doesn't necessarily, especially with the injury, he doesn't necessarily need to learn new techniques or something like that. He's already doing things at a high level. He just needs to know what routes to run and how to be in the correct position, which takes time in the offense as well. So if I go a little bit further in my summary here, I say Addison addresses the football with good technique and can make catches outside of his frame effectively. So hands technique for a wide receiver, if you're watching me, overhand, you want your hands kind of to make a diamond shape, and you want the ball to hit them, and you want that to kind of lead. You need them extended out from your frame. Let me get that clear first. And you need, you want it to almost be a cushion, so you're slowing the ball and your hands kind of move back in. That's why it's important to have them outside your frame. Because when they're in your frame, or you try to catch it underhand and it hits your chest first, it's likely to bounce off of your chest and just fall to the ground as a drop. I would say there are a couple lapses from Addison where he doesn't use the proper overhand versus underhand technique, and there is an underhand technique for balls that are low. But one of the things I was also impressed with at Addison is his ability to track balls over his shoulder, which isn't something all players can do. But he was getting open deep a lot at USC because he's a really good receiver, right? And he tracked balls over his shoulder very well. That requires a lot of coordination in terms of looking back over your shoulder and kind of making the catch in the basket there over your shoulder. It's not necessarily an easy skill that all receivers can do. So it was good to see that from him. I said he shows fluidity and athleticism after the catch, making strong decisions and setting up blockers well. So he's not, an elite after the catch player like a Dante Hall type, right, who's going to make 8 players miss. But he understands how to get upfield. He understands where his lead blockers are on things like screens and that sort of thing, so he can play off of that leverage to choose the correct hole to go to. And he's very fluid transitioning from a catch to turning upfield. Just like he's fluid in and out of route breaks, he's fluid transitioning from a catch moving upfield. So that helps him gain, 1 to 2 extra yards, where a clumsier player wouldn't necessarily be able to do that.
He's got a pretty sick juke.
Yeah, and I don't know. I wouldn't say he's got a sick, he doesn't have the Dante Hall highlight level jukes. He's not going to make 5 players miss after the catch and run 20 yards for a touchdown. But he does have good balance, too. There are a couple plays, especially a long touchdown against Stanford, where he beats the cornerback deep, right? It's a deep post route. The cornerback tries to wrap him and tackle him, and Addison gets spun fully 360 and maintains his balance basically like he's in stride. So he's got good balance, and he's got great body control, right? That's the main point, is he's got phenomenal body control. He's not an electric, juke, spin move, all that sort of stuff to make guys miss player, but his body control gives him a benefit after the catch.
I'm referring specifically to that left to right or right to left. Yeah, that move I think is pretty good for him. But.
Yeah, it's fine. I'm not trying to diminish who he is. I'm just saying like Zay Flowers is probably a better after the catch player than Jordan Addison was, right? Who went 1 pick before him. It's not like he was the top or will be the top in the NFL. He is. I don't want to use Justin Jefferson because I think Justin Jefferson is a little bit better of an after the catch player because his body control is just absolutely ridiculous. It's absurd. But Addison is more in the Justin Jefferson level where he's not going to break 5 million tackles, but he's going to maximize the yardage that he does have available to him. Yeah, I was going to say, the one thing with Addison, I do think it holds true that he lacks the dynamic speed of a true... He lacks the dynamic juke potential or the dynamic speed of a true elite deep threat or a true elite after the catch player, right? Addison's size limits him as a blocker a little bit. He actually does a good job understanding and positioning himself and getting in the way and knowing where he needs to go, and he's not afraid to get into the mix a little bit, which is great for a player of his size. He doesn't shy away from that contact, but he will get knocked back pretty heavily by defenders when they try to take him on with a level of in a serious manner, right? So a lot of times all you need from receivers is a position block. You just need them to get in the way. So I think it's fine at the NFL level, but he's not going to be doing the role that KJ Osborne or Cooper Kupp has done in this offense, right? Where he's asked to move into the box and do a lot of dirty work in terms of digging out a safety or something while he's blocking. He's just not physically capable of that from a size. So that's kind of the positives. Obviously, I do have some downsides. I do think he struggles to get off press coverage against more physical defenders. There were examples against Oregon's Rajon Wright, who's a 6'2", 200-pound corner, right? He's a big guy, where he struggled against that. He can get bullied at the catch point, so defenders can knock him off of his spot, essentially, and prevent him from making the catch because he can't get in position to get the football, or he's not big enough to use his body to shield the ball from opposing defenders. So he's sustaining a hit through contact, and he's not able to bring that ball down because he doesn't quite have the body size. I said on pure fades, he struggled a little bit. There weren't a lot of true fade. A lot of the times he won over the middle of the field in deep overs and posts in the deep area of the field. He wasn't winning one-on-one in fades against corners who could run with him. So I do think that is a little bit of a concern as well, where he's not going to win in that. And like I said, he gets physically overpowered as a blocker. So basically, my downsides are the concerns that I had going into the draft, right? And I think that those do hold true on tape, where he lacks the elite high end speed, which might turn him into a dynamic number one NFL receiver, like a top 10 NFL receiver, right? But I think all of the things that I've talked about make him a phenomenal complementary receiver, and he can be a top 10 number two receiver, if that makes sense, right? Where he's in the top 20 in the NFL. Like, I think he can truly develop into that type of player. He's just not going to be an elite, matchup proof player.
He, one one of his greatest skills is going to be playing opposite Justin Jefferson.
Mm-hmm.
This is kind of what you mean, and I agree completely.
No, I mean that's just about the biggest advantage I think you can give a player, right? Is to give him
Yeah,
an awesome player next to him, and I think that's actually critical for the Vikings. Having secondary options when teams take away your first option is critical, right? Like, we saw the Bengals Chiefs game 2 years ago, right, where the Bengals ended up shutting down Mahomes in the second half and winning that game. The Bengals, what did they do? They took away Tyreek Hill and they took away Travis Kelce, and they said, at all costs, you are not going to be able to go to these guys. And the Chiefs couldn't run the ball, and they didn't have a tertiary option in the receiving game that they could rely on to win for them, right? The Vikings last year, what did they do when teams took away Justin Jefferson? The only player who was able to win on a reliable basis was TJ Hawkinson once they traded him, right? They weren't winning running the football. Their running game was terrible. It was inefficient. So what did the Chiefs do last year that allowed them to beat the Bengals? They diversified the receiving room a little bit, right? They got rid of Tyreek Hill, but they added Juju Smith-Schuster, MVS, and they added Kadarius Toney late as well, while still having Travis Kelce. And then they made the run game more of a focal point with Isaiah Pacheco, and then also, I mean, Jerick McKinnon, frankly, got mixed in there quite a bit too as a receiving option late in the season. I think he had almost like 10 touchdowns last year somehow,
yeah,
if you think
yeah.
about it. So,
I think he had a stretch of like 6 weeks with a touchdown or something like that.
yeah.
It's crazy.
So, those combinations, you know, give you more options. And the Vikings are trying to do that with investing in maybe a more diverse run game this year. They have TJ Hawkinson on the roster still, and Addison, I think, adds a third player in the passing game that they really can rely on and go to if teams try to take away Jefferson.
Awesome. Any other thoughts on Jordan, or would you like to move on to our third round pick?
No, I think we can move around to our third round pick.
All right.
One comparison I guess I would make for Addison, just to get people to think about it a little bit. This is not a stylistic comparison for who Addison is as a player. Maybe, I mean, people have thrown around Calvin Ridley. I think that's fair. I think, was it Isaac? It's either Isaac Bruce or Torrey Holt. I think one of those players might actually be the true. I forget who was basically a size match for him, but one of those players might be the true comparison for Jordan Addison if you're thinking about what he can reach as his ceiling, right?
Isaac was pretty big, wasn't he? Isaac Bruce.
Yeah, it might have been
Um,
Torrey Holt then.
yeah, I
Um,
think Isaac was. Let me
but
see. I think.
But yeah, so my comparison for who he can be in terms of production is when Juju Smith Schuster had Antonio Brown across from him in Pittsburgh. Like, there were people who were arguing that Juju was better than Stephon Diggs, which was absurd from day one. Like, you just watch the tape, people. But also, Juju was massively productive. I think he had like a 1,400-yard season. I think Justin Jefferson will command more of the passing game, so Addison won't reach that point, but I think he will be a very productive player.
Bruce.
Who's
Bruce was
Isaac
six
Bruce?
feet,
Yeah.
188. Yeah,
If you
so
look at Isaac Bruce's athletic profile, like, it's almost identical to what Jordan Addison did in the draft. And obviously, it's entirely different eras, so it's a little bit different. Like, you wouldn't expect. Isaac Bruce was probably faster comparatively than whatever 40 time he ran, if he was running in today's era. But
yeah.
I digress. Like, I think he might be the true ceiling of, like, a really actually a Hall of Fame player is what Isaac Bruce is. So that's the true, upper ceiling. I don't think, there should be any expectation that Edison has to get there, right? That's a ridiculous expectation to put on a rookie player. But,
Sure.
he should be great next to Justin Jefferson, I think.
Awesome. Awesome. Well, looking forward to seeing him take his first snaps as a rookie in the NFL. Let's move on to our next rookie. We did not have a second round pick, so the next rookie that we drafted in the third round, we finally got our corner, Mekhi
Yeah.
Blackmon, a corner who, if I recall correctly, was mocked in the first more than once. If I recall correctly, I saw his name popping in there occasionally. But
He may have been, but ultimately, I think he deserved. Like, he
where
went
you
in
should,
roughly the range he would have gone in from a consensus perspective. Arif Hassan's consensus board, the Vikings overdrafted him a little bit. Like, he was more of a fourth round player, which I mean, he went at the very end of the third round, right? But he was
right,
more of a fourth round player in that. Data than he was, certainly a first round player. Probably the reason he was mocked as a first round player is that PFF actually absolutely loved his final season. Like, he was the third highest rated overall corner out of, 200, 300 players
sure,
basically in PFF's database for last season. He had a 91.1 coverage grade, which rated third, right? His 90.6 overall grade was fourth overall, and that was actually out of 500 qualifying players, right? So that's a ton of corners. That's better than top 1%,
yeah.
right?
Well, he joins a team that is in desperate need of depth at the position, so
Yeah,
he's a welcome addition. Um, Tell us a little bit about Mekhi Blackmon for those of us like me who aren't super familiar with him.
yeah. So I'll give you his background. He was lightly recruited out of college. He went to JUCO first, and then he went to Colorado. He was at Colorado for 4 years before going to USC, so he's a bit of an older prospect. I think he's 23 this season. And his last year at Colorado was really his first time as a full time starter. That was 2021. Obviously, 2022. I think it was actually a starter in 2022 as well. They just played a lot fewer games, so he didn't get as many snaps, right? Because, I'm sorry, 2020, because it was the COVID year, and the Pac 12 didn't really play a lot of football that year. But he played over 900 snaps at USC last year. He was their clear number one corner. He was outside. He was primarily outside. He played more in the slot at Colorado, but he did track opposing players. Like, he followed opposing receivers, and it was kind of a matchup based thing. He had 3 interceptions, 12 pass deflections, 66 tackles that year. I mentioned some of the PFF grades. Obviously, he was very highly rated this past year in PFF. He was almost equally highly rated in man and zone. He played a lot of man and a lot of zone at USC, so that kind of versatility is going to be very important for Brian Flores' defense. Um, yeah, his pass rating when targeted was only 46.1, and then he had 21 total run and pass stops with just 2 missed tackles on 42 tackle attempts. So he was pretty solid as a tackler. Um, I will say the one thing again
Before,
that you get when you look at Mekhi Blackman's profile is he's undersized. We're going to talk about this quite a bit. He's 5'10", 178 is what he weighed in the combine. Go ahead, Greg.
I wanted to ask you because we went really in depth with this on the Flores pod. Uh, maybe you're going to get to this in your notes, and if you are,
Yeah.
ignore me and let's move on. But um, tackling is a must for corners in this defense.
Yes.
How do you feel about what you've seen from him? And then
I
I'll
I
continue.
think that Mekhi Blackman is a very aggressive tackler. Like, he's absolutely willing to stick his nose in there and try to make plays in the tackle. So he's had some issues with the way he's reading the play, particularly against Tulane, who had Tyjae Spears, who I think we both liked a lot as a running back in this draft. But he
Yeah,
would try to, when he was a force player who had force contained. So the way this works is if you're a cornerback and the run is to your side, especially if you're in press coverage, you are what is known as a force player. That means you have to stay as far outside as possible, and you cannot let the run come outside you. The idea is the safeties and linebackers can help in the middle, but it's harder for them to get out to the edge, right? So there were times in that game in particular where he tried to where he abandoned his force responsibility, tried to cut inside to make a play, and that let the run go outside of him. That's a big no for me as a cornerback in run defense. I mean, it's something that should be able to be coached up pretty easily,
correct.
and he's very willing and aggressive as a player in run defense to make the tackles. He doesn't have a lot of size, which I was just going to get to, so that is a little bit of a question mark. But
Yep.
I think ultimately the size won't be as big a like the size for Mekhi Blackmon is not quite as big of a concern as it was for me with Jordan Addison actually, and I'll get into
Okay.
why.
Well, we'll continue. Yeah, continue your thoughts about size. But I was just curious because we had talked so much about tackling. So
Yeah, so 5'11", 178 at the combine, 31-inch arms. 31-inch arms is kind of the threshold for corners in terms of arm length. So he does meet that threshold. I know Nick and I talked quite a bit last year about guys like Roger McCreary or Trent McDuffie, who ended up going in the first round, who we were looking at corners heavily, who were under that threshold for arm length. And that's a pretty major concern to me. So I'm glad he hits that. His broad jump was really good. His vertical jump was about average, and his 40-yard dash was a 4.47. So I think that's more than enough speed for a corner. Um, you know, you're not going to be able to win against the Tyreek Hills, but it's very rare for players to be able to do that. And with a third round pick, like beggars can't be choosers at that point, right? Like I'm not expecting a day one shutdown elite corner from a late third round pick. His 10 split, his explosiveness was a 1.47. I think that very much shows up on tape. So he's a very explosive, a very twitchy athlete, I think. So and the reason I'm not as concerned is my comp for Mekhi Blackmon, or one of my comp in the Flores Belichick defense, let's say, is Jack Jones, a player out of Arizona State who was a fifth round pick last year, played like the third most snaps for the Patriots defense. The Patriots had like the best defense in the NFL, the best pass defense in the NFL last year, and they did it with a bunch of guys who were 5'10" and under 200 pounds, in Jonathan Jones being their primary corner, Jack Jones being that guy, Marcus Jones because they were just the Joneses in that secondary. Didn't play a ton, but there was another corner, I think Miles Bryant, who was their slot corner, who's like 5'8". The only corner on their roster, I've hit this a ton, who was over that 6 foot mark was Jalen Mills, who played relatively often, but that was a specific role for him in the defense. So I think that this defense can be run with smaller corners. I'm not too worried about the size aspect of being able to match up with receivers, as long as we do have bigger, longer corners than the Vikings do in a Caleb Evans and Andrew Booth. Now, obviously, that requires a lot from Caleb Evans and Andrew Booth to be able to even see the field, right? Because we haven't seen anything from those two guys really in their careers to this point. Granted, it's only been the one season, but I'm okay with Mekhi Blackmon and Byron Murphy, who's also a smaller player, being on the field at the same time. Like I don't think that that's going to be a roadblock to the Vikings' success as long as they have a player who can match up against those bigger players, which hopefully they have at least somewhere on the roster. Right? This defense has a ton of questions. We don't need to get into that right now. It's like who's going to answer that question. Who's going to match up against big guys is not going to be Mekhi Blackmon, but I'm not concerned about him being on the field as long as they can answer that question with somebody else if he's on the field with Byron Murphy at the same time. A little bit convoluted there. Hopefully that makes sense.
no, it makes sense. It does.
So with my scouting report, I was able to only really watch 3 games of Blackmon, so I didn't have as much tape as I did on the USC offense. I got Stanford, UCLA, and against Tulane. The Stanford game was great because I did get to see him go against taller receivers. Elijah Higgins was actually drafted as a tight end, and Michael Wilson was drafted by the Cardinals as a wide receiver. He's 6'2", like in the 220. Both were, over 6 foot, almost 6'4", I think is what Elijah Higgins, and basically like 230 pounds. So he's competing against some very big guys in that game. I said Blackmon's a quick quarterback who has the movement skills to track receivers through multiple breaks. So, like Addison is very quick and able to, defeat corners on breaks. I'm sure the matchups in practice were awesome between By the way, teammates at USC, right? 1 year teammates at USC, Jordan Addison and Mekhi Blackmon. I'm sure the one-on-one matchups between those two guys were ultra competitive. But he's able to keep with receivers through multiple breaks, which
this is the teammate draft. We had four of our 6 draft picks played football together. Sorry.
Yeah. So I said he's got adequate speed for the position. I think he can cover most receivers, and he can press receivers effectively at the line of scrimmage. And that's something which, again, at his size, might not be something you expect him to do just looking at his profile. But he did it often at USC. He was big in man coverage, and he pressed guys a ton at USC. So he's very much able to do that and comfortable in that role, which is something that's important in the Florida's defense. And again, going back to my rant on how the Belichick defense, with the Patriots last year didn't have bigger corners. Guess what? They pressed guys a ton too. So, smaller guys are capable of doing that. I would say that Blackmon suffers lapses of technique sometime in press. Like, he's not a polished press player that leave him out of position. So he'll try to punch too hard and he ends up out of position, or he will, in some cases, particularly without breaking routes, flip his hips too early, and that kind of gets him out of position a little bit. Where he tries to run with a vertical route and allows something to go inside on him. He's also grabby as a corner. I think this is almost universally true for college players because they don't call the game as tight as they do in the NFL, but he tends to grab receivers a lot. There were a number of plays I noted that would have been holding in the NFL that didn't get called to that level, particularly when he was going against the bigger players in Stanford. What I like about that, though, is he's physical throughout the route on the catch point with good ball skills to knock down and intercept the ball. He's got great ball skills. He had a ton of pass deflections, as I noted. He's got 3 interceptions. There's a play against Stanford where he gets an interception by going through the visual of, when a corner sticks his hand through a receiver's hand to try to knock the ball out. That's a technique every corner's taught. He's very proficient at that, and he gets his hand up in there, deflects the ball up, and then is able to make the catch as well when the ball's in the air. So that kind of tells you the level of ball tracking skills that Blackmon has. I think he's really good as a ball tracker and has good ball skills. So what I'm kind of getting at here is Blackmon's a little bit raw at the position. Like, I think he's very quick. He's got good movement skills. He's very sticky to stick with players. But from a technical perspective, he has a couple things that he needs to get cleaned up and do a little bit better. He shuffles at USC, and I think that's something that he would benefit from doing a back pedal. So a shuffle, your hips are turned kind of towards the sideline that you expect the receiver to go to. And where I mentioned earlier, that on out-breaking routes or routes that stem outside, he tends to turn his hips a little bit too early. I think the shuffle technique might contribute to that, whereas a back pedal, you stay square with the receiver rather than turning your hips. So I think that combination and learning to backpedal a little bit might help him out. And then I said, in zone coverage, Blackmon has a feel for the receivers around him and positions himself well. He has NFL-level click and close ability, right? That comes from that burst and that quickness I talked about earlier. In the run game, he can get overpowered, but he shows a willingness to stick his nose in against runs. Like, he takes on blocks violently. So it's not that he's not willing. It's just sometimes he's a little bit undersized and can get blocked out by players. He gets the job done as a tackler. He's got few missed tackles in his career. He could probably do a little bit better from a technique perspective as a tackler as well. But ultimately it kind of is what it is. I think for the Vikings, his best fit maybe is a slot corner, right? He's a little bit undersized. He's got the quickness to play in the slot, which I think is very necessary to play in the slot. And that's not a derogatory thing for a slot corner. It's just the larger outside receivers might not, he might not be able to match up with them one-on-one. There were a couple of instances where he got beat in that Stanford game by players just being able to be larger than him and more physical than him, right? And then on top of that, the Vikings have corners who I think are more suited to the outside. Like Byron Murphy, I have no question about his ability to play on the outside in the NFL level. I think he's done it at a high level. And Andrew Booth and Caleb Evans, I have more questions about them playing in the slot than I do them playing outside, right? So that kind of leads me to think the best role for Blackmon might be in the slot as a nickel player, right? So Byron Murphy, he comes in as kind of that third cornerback if he's able to do it. And he is 24. I think I might have mentioned he's 23. He's actually 24 this season. So, I'm hoping he's not limited by that age. Like, a lot of times it's hard for guys to put on weight past a certain point. Once when you're 20 and 21, it's a lot easier for guys to bulk up, right? Than it is maybe when they're approaching their mid-20s. So I'm kind of interested to see how that plays out. But that's Mekhi Blackmon in a nutshell.
Awesome. Yeah, it should be interesting to see, how effective he can be right off the bat. We've had a few players at that position who still need development, and we'll see if he's going to be in that mold or if he's going to step on the field and be effective for us right away. Yeah. So Matt, has well, we both have time constraints this afternoon, so we're going to have to put pause on the evaluations here for the rest of the draft. We've still got a handful of players to go through, one of which probably the player you're most excited about, our undrafted free agent, Ivan Pace, and I'm excited to hear what you have to say about him. But let's put that on the back burner for now. We're gonna stop the pod and just Matt, where can people find you on Twitter?
Yeah, so I'm at Fries Football on Twitter. Nick obviously is at Nick Olson NFL, and we got through 4 players today. Really, if you count
Yeah,
Z and Dalvin Cook, we got 4 more players to go. So we should be or is it 5 more players to go? Anyway, we should be able to get this done in another roughly hour episode. Maybe we'll go a little bit longer next time.
Absolutely. This was a teaser, like a really good teaser.
This is Draft Picks Part 1, baby. We got Draft Picks Part 2 coming up.
Absolutely. And you can find me on Instagram at You've Been Gregged. And you can find us as a group on Twitter at Kindred Skulls. Or if you want to watch our video content, I know we have some viewers as well. You can find us on YouTube by searching for Kindred Skulls. 2 words. And that's going to wrap it up for this week. We'll be back next week with part 2 of our draft pod. Matt, digital hugs.
Digital hugs. Skull Vikings, baby.
Don't lift those arms too high.
Skull Vikings.
Skull.
Skull, baby.
Another first round corner wouldn't do us any harm. Oh, another first round corner wouldn't do us any harm. Oh, another first round corner wouldn't do us any harm. And we'll all cheer on behind, and we'll score.